Redditor 1. I've never tried to write this down before. Never told anyone outside of my family, and even then it was only a couple of times. There's a part of me that's still scared of what might happen if it gets out there in the wrong way or to the wrong people. But it's been eating at me for years, and maybe putting it down will help. Or maybe it'll just make things worse. I don't know. It was the summer before 8th grade, that age where you think you're invincible, where sneaking out at midnight with your friends feels like the height of rebellion. It was me and 2 of my closest friends, and we had a plan. Walk around the neighborhood, maybe stop by and see these girls a block over who were having a sleepover. Typical. We slipped out around midnight, keeping to the quiet streets. The neighborhood was one of those suburban sprawl types, rows of houses with perfectly trimmed lawns, streetlights spaced just far enough apart to leave patches of shadow. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We were laughing, whispering, and trying to keep quiet, though in hindsight we were probably louder than we thought. Then we turned a corner, and that's when everything changed. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, in the sky above us, was this enormous black object. It was shaped like a blimp, but it was bigger than anything I'd ever seen before. Massive, easily the size of 4 or 5 football fields, no exaggeration. And it was close. So close, it felt like I could reach up and touch it if I tried. It didn't make a sound, not a hum, not a whisper. Just this hulking mass of black, polished metal hanging there in the sky. The surface was smooth, reflective, like gunmetal that had been buffed to a shine. No lights, no movement, nothing. Just stillness. We stopped dead in our tracks, staring up at it, too stunned to move. "Do you see that?" I remember asking. My friends nodded, their faces pale in the dim glow of the streetlights. We kept asking each other the same thing, over and over, like we needed the reassurance. "Do you see it? Is it real?" And every time, the answer was yes. I don't know how long we stood there. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the world narrowing to just us and the thing in the sky. Then, nothing. I don't mean it flew away or vanished. I mean my memory just stops. The next thing I know, I'm staring at this tiny, glowing object in the sky. It looked like a white barbell, falling slowly to the ground with wisps of smoke trailing off it. That's when we heard the trucks. 2 black pickups came tearing down the street, engines roaring, tires screeching. They were going way too fast, easily 70 miles an hour in a residential neighborhood where the limit was 25. The trucks were identical, brand new, with silver toolboxes gleaming in the moonlight. They didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just barreled past us and disappeared into the night. After that, everything felt fuzzy, disconnected. The 3 of us walked back to one of my friends' houses in silence. By the time we got there, the sun was starting to rise and the world felt surreal, like we'd stepped out of a dream we couldn't quite remember. It was almost 6 in the morning. None of us had any idea where the time had gone. We made a pact to tell my dad about it the next day. He worked for the city, and we figured maybe he'd know something. Maybe there'd been a test flight or a power outage or something that could explain what we saw. But when morning came, none of us said a word. It was like the memory of the night before had become too heavy to share, too strange to say out loud. We never talked about it again, not really. One of the friends I was with that night drifted out of my life, and the other, my best friend, stayed close for a while. But even with him, it was like there was this unspoken barrier between us, a mutual agreement to leave that night untouched. We reconnected years later on Facebook, but even then, neither of us brought it up. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones who saw it. That thing was huge, hovering silently above a densely populated suburb. There's no way hundreds of other people didn't see it too, but there was nothing on the news, no whispers in the neighborhood, no reports in the paper, just silence, like the whole thing had been erased from existence. The idea of that scares me more than anything else, not the possibility of abduction or the trucks or even the craft itself. It's the silence, the fact that something so massive, so undeniable, could appear over a city and then vanish without a trace, that there might be others out there who saw it too but are keeping quiet. I've thought about hypnosis, wondering if it could help fill in the gaps. But the idea terrifies me. What if the gaps are there for a reason? What if remembering would only make things worse? And even if I wanted to try, how could I trust the results? I was just a kid back then, and memory's a tricky thing. What I do know is this: that night happened. That thing in the sky was real. The glowing barbell, the trucks, the time loss, all of it was real. And I refuse to believe we were the only ones who saw it. There's no way something that big, that close, went unnoticed. But for some reason, no one's talking about it. Maybe they're scared. Or maybe, like us, they're stuck in this strange limbo of half-remembered fear and unanswered questions. Whatever the truth is, it's out there. I just don't know if I'll ever be ready to find it. Redditor 2. My mom has always had a way of telling stories that pulls you in. Her voice calm but steady, every word carefully chosen. This one, though, she only told me once. And even now, years later, I can still see the way her hands trembled just slightly when she started talking, the way her voice faltered when she reached the parts she couldn't explain. She was a teenager at the time, best friends with a girl named Lisa. They spent almost every day together, inseparable in the way only teenage girls can be, and one of their favorite things to do was climb onto the roof of Lisa's house to stargaze. It was a small town, the kind of place where the nights are dark and quiet, the stars brighter than they seem anywhere else. My mom said it was peaceful up there, the perfect place to talk about everything and nothing at all. One night, they were sitting on the roof, laughing and sharing secrets like they always did. Then, they noticed a bright light in the sky, brighter than anything they'd ever seen before. It wasn't a star or an airplane or anything familiar. It hovered there, pulsing slightly, almost like it was alive. Neither of them spoke. They just stared, transfixed, as the light seemed to grow brighter and closer. My mom says she remembers turning to Lisa, wanting to say something, but before she could, everything went black. The next thing she knew, the light was gone, and she and Lisa were still sitting on the roof, the stars twinkling peacefully above them. But something was wrong. They thought they'd been on the roof for maybe 15 minutes, but when they checked the time, it was hours later. 3 hours, gone without a trace. My mom couldn't remember anything about what had happened during that time, no matter how hard she tried. Lisa, on the other hand, refused to even talk about it. Anytime my mom brought it up, Lisa would brush her off with a vague, "I don't know," or change the subject entirely. For a while, they let it go. Life moved on, and eventually my mom's family moved to a different state. She and Lisa lost touch, and the strange night on the roof became one of those half-forgotten memories, the kind you push to the back of your mind and try not to think about too much. It wasn't until 10 years later that my mom saw Lisa again. She'd gone back to her hometown for a visit and decided to track her down, curious to see how her old friend was doing. When they met, my mom said Lisa looked different. She was still the same person, but there was something about her, a dreamy, distant quality, like she was there but not really there. She seemed serene in a way that felt almost unnatural, like she'd found some kind of peace my mom couldn't quite understand. They talked for a while, catching up on each other's lives. Then, out of nowhere, Lisa brought up the night on the roof. At first, my mom didn't know what to say. She told Lisa she still didn't remember anything about it, just the bright light and the lost time. But Lisa remembered. She remembered everything. She said it had taken years for the memories to come back, and when they did, they came in pieces, confusing and terrifying at first. But as time went on, the pieces started to fit together, and she began to remember it all. Lisa told my mom that the light had been a craft, something not of this world. She said they'd been taken aboard, paralyzed somehow, unable to move or speak while invasive experiments were performed on them. The memories of that first experience were fragmented, but they were enough to terrify her. For years, she avoided thinking about it, too scared to even acknowledge it had happened. But it didn't stop there. Lisa said she'd been taken again, 3 more times over the years. Each time, the experience was different. At first, it was the same as before: paralysis, experiments, a sense of helplessness. But eventually, things changed. They stopped probing her and began communicating with her instead. They didn't speak in any language she recognized, but she could understand them somehow, their words forming in her mind without sound. She said they told her things about space, about Earth, about life itself. They told her that she would get pregnant in a specific year and that the child would be stillborn. They told her she would never have children again. And, most hauntingly, they told her they had tried to save her from this fate but had failed. The predictions came true, down to the last detail. Lisa also told my mom something she hadn't expected, that they'd taken her too. After that night on the roof, they'd abducted my mom at least once more, though my mom had no memory of it. She said she sometimes had nightmares about being taken, dreams so vivid they left her shaken, but she'd always dismissed them as just that. When my mom asked Lisa why she seemed so calm, so at peace with it all, Lisa just smiled. She said that every time she spoke with them, she came to understand more of the truth. When my mom asked what the truth was, Lisa's answer was vague and unsettling. "You'll know eventually," she said. "And when you do, it'll all make sense." My mom saw Lisa a few more times over the years. Lisa had a normal life. She wasn't obsessed with aliens or abductions, and she didn't bring it up unless my mom did. She was still distant, still dreamy, but she seemed happy, content. My mom could never quite wrap her head around it. Even now, she says she doesn't know what to believe. She doesn't remember being abducted, and she doesn't have any proof that it happened. But she also can't explain the lost time, the recurring nightmares, or the way Lisa seemed so certain about everything. I've thought about it a lot since she told me the story. Part of me wants to believe it's just a strange coincidence, a shared delusion, or maybe even a fabrication. But the way my mom told it, the look in her eyes as she described Lisa's certainty, makes me think there's more to it. And the scariest part, I don't know if I'll ever find out what the truth really is, or if I even want to. Redditor 3. I've replayed that night in my head more times than I can count, trying to fit the pieces together into something that makes sense, but every time I come up empty. This is what I know, and even now it feels like I'm telling someone else's story. It was a typical Friday night. I'd finished classes for the week at Indiana University and decided to head home for the weekend. It was a 2-hour drive, one I'd made dozens of times before. I left Bloomington around 10 p.m., cruising through the quiet stretch of rural highway with nothing but the radio and the hum of the engine to keep me company. The sky was clear, the air cold, and the roads empty. Exactly how I liked it. At exactly 10:53 p.m., I noticed flashing lights behind me. My stomach sank. Great, a ticket. I eased off the gas, checking the rearview mirror. The lights were bright, but didn't seem to be gaining on me. Still, I figured it was better to pull over and let them pass, or face whatever ticket was coming. About a quarter-mile ahead, I spotted a turnoff onto a country road and decided to pull over there. The road was narrow and surrounded by fields, a perfect spot to stop without blocking traffic. As I brought the car to a halt and reached for the glove box to grab my registration and insurance, I noticed something odd. The lights behind me were gone. No cruiser, no headlights, nothing. I leaned out the window, peering into the darkness, but the road was empty. Weird, I thought. Maybe they turned around? That's when my car started acting up. The radio began flipping through stations on its own, the volume surging and fading like someone was twisting the knob frantically. The dome light flickered overhead, and the headlights blinked on and off like they were caught in a malfunctioning loop. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the chaos unfold. My first thought was a failing battery or an electrical short, but it didn't feel right. It felt intentional. I leaned down to pop the hood, figuring I'd take a quick look at the battery. That's the last thing I remember. The next thing I knew, I was lying on my back, staring up at the sky. The stars were so bright it was almost overwhelming, like someone had turned the contrast up on the universe. The air was icy against my skin, and, as I sat up, disoriented, I realized I wasn't in my car anymore. I was in the middle of a field, surrounded by the dry, rustling remains of corn stalks from a recent harvest. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to piece together how I'd gotten there. My heart was pounding, my breath visible in the cold air. Then it hit me. Where's my car? Panic set in as I scanned the horizon, but all I could see was a faint glow of headlights in the distance, far off down the road. I stumbled to my feet, brushing dirt off my jeans, and started walking toward the lights. The field was uneven, and the brittle stalks crunched under my boots with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone, but the field was empty. Just me and the star. When I reached the road, I saw the signs, 350N and 50W. I recognized the intersection. It was about half a mile from where I'd pulled over. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How did I end up here? The only thing to do was walk back to my car, so I started down the road, the chill in the air seeping into my bones. It couldn't have taken more than 10 or 15 minutes to reach the spot where I'd left my car. But when I got there, it was dark. No headlights, no interior lights, just an unmoving silhouette against the faint glow of the moon. The battery was completely dead, which struck me as odd. I hadn't been gone long enough for it to drain like that, right? I opened the door and slumped into the driver's seat, trying to collect myself. My phone was sitting on the passenger seat, exactly where I'd left it. When I picked it up, the screen lit up and my stomach dropped. The time was 2:17 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed. I sat there in silence, staring at the clock, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't account for the missing time, couldn't remember anything past leaning down to pop the hood. It was like my brain had skipped ahead, erasing whatever had happened in between. I stayed there for another half hour, trying to calm down, trying to think of a rational explanation. But nothing made sense. The flashing lights, the malfunctioning electronics, waking up in a field miles away, it all felt like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But it had happened. It was real. Eventually, I remembered the battery was dead, so I called AAA for a jump. The dispatcher told me it would be about an hour, given how far out I was. I spent that hour sitting in the dark, replaying everything in my head, running through every possible scenario. None of them felt right. When the tow truck finally arrived, the driver didn't ask many questions. He gave me a jump, I thanked him, and I drove home in silence. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone, just drove, my hands gripping the wheel tightly the entire way. I've only told this story to one person, my uncle. He listened quietly, nodding here and there, but didn't offer much in the way of advice or comfort. Weird things happen, he said. Sometimes it's best not to dig too deep. I've thought about hypnosis, wondering if it could help me recover those missing hours, but the idea terrifies me. What if I remember something I'm not ready to face? What if the gaps in my memory are there for a reason? To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know how I ended up in that field, or why my car's electronics went haywire, or why I lost 3 hours of my life. But I know it wasn't normal. It wasn't something I can explain away or forget. And every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I can't help but glance at the sky, wondering if it's still out there, wondering if it's waiting for me. Redditor 4. I've dealt with sleep paralysis for years, and every time it happens, it feels like my mind is testing just how far it can push me before I completely lose it. It started in my early 20s, creeping into my life like an uninvited guest. At first, it was just a few moments of stillness, that eerie feeling of waking up and being unable to move. But over time, the episodes grew darker, more vivid, more real, and that's where it gets complicated, because sometimes I can't tell if what I experienced was a dream or something far worse. The first time I had what I now call the alien abduction dream, I was lying in bed after a long day. My dad and I had been watching one of those UFO documentaries earlier in the evening, the kind that's all dramatic music and grainy footage of strange lights in the sky. I fell asleep thinking about it, and at some point in the night, I woke up. Or thought I did. Flashes of blue light filled my room, bright and pulsating like lightning strikes frozen in time. I couldn't move. My chest felt heavy, pinned to the bed, but at the same time I felt something pulling at me, lifting me upward. The sensation was so vivid I could feel the pressure, the weightlessness, as if gravity had let me go. My body arched, my chest lifting toward the ceiling, and my arms stretched stiffly behind me as if they were holding me up. The light grew blinding, pure white, and the sound started a loud mechanical whirring like a drill or some kind of massive engine. It vibrated through my entire body, drowning out every thought, every rational explanation I tried to cling to. I could feel myself being taken somewhere, pulled towards something I couldn't see. It wasn't just fear I felt. It was a primal terror, the kind that reaches down to the deepest part of your mind and convinces you that nothing will ever be safe again. I stared up at the ceiling. The torch itself, And then it was over. I woke up sitting upright in bed, my chest still arched, my arms locked behind me, supporting my weight. My heart was racing, my breath shallow and ragged. The room was dark and silent again, as if nothing had happened. But it felt so real, too real. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. That's the thing about sleep paralysis. It blurs the line between reality and nightmare until you're left wondering which side you're standing on. After that night, I started researching sleep paralysis and the alien abduction phenomenon, and I realized how many people had stories just like mine. Flashes of light, mechanical sounds, the sensation of being lifted from bed. It all lined up. I told myself it was my brain playing tricks on me, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. The second time. The worst episode happened about a year later. This time, it wasn't aliens. It was something else, something darker. In the dream, or the paralysis, whatever it was, I was driving. The car felt real, the wheels solid under my hands, the hum of the engine vibrating through my feet. I pulled into a carport lit by those sickly yellow fluorescent lights, the kind that make everything look pale and unnatural. I put the car in park and tried to get out, but my legs felt like they'd turned to jelly. I couldn't move, couldn't stand. I just sat there, frozen, as a voice began whispering in my ear. The voice was low and rasping, barely more than a breath, but the words were clear. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was teasing, mocking, dripping with malice. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but listen as it grew louder and more insistent, filling the car with its presence. My skin crawled, every hair on my body stood on end as the whispers turned into something worse, suggestive, invasive. I could feel the heat of its breath against my neck, the weight of something pressing against me though I couldn't see it. The fear was so overwhelming I thought I might pass out, but I couldn't wake up. I was trapped. And then, just like that, I was awake. My room was still, the only sound my ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, my body trembling, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that dream hadn't just been in my head. It had touched me, somehow. And I couldn't decide which was worse, the idea that my brain could conjure something so vivid and horrifying, or the possibility that it was real. I've read about how people in different eras interpreted sleep paralysis. In medieval times, they called it old hag syndrome, believing a witch or demon was sitting on their chest, stealing their breath. Other cultures talked about shadow people, incubuses, and spirits. It's no wonder so many alien abduction stories have details that sound like sleep paralysis dreams. The sensations, the fear, the loss of control, it all fits. But sometimes I wonder if there's more to it. What if it isn't just dreams? What if the things people claim to see, aliens, demons, shadows, are real, but they exist in a way our minds can barely comprehend? What if sleep paralysis is the only time we're vulnerable enough to notice them, to feel their presence? I don't have answers, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that those nights stay with me, burned into my memory like scars. I don't tell many people about them because who would believe me? Even I question it sometimes, wondering if it's all just some cruel trick of my subconscious. But then there are moments, quiet, sleepless moments, when I think about the way that voice felt, the way the light wrapped around me, and I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my mind, that maybe, just maybe, something else was there, something watching, something waiting. Redditor 5. We were heading south toward a wildfire near Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, 4 fire rigs in an enclosed convoy. The air was dry, the kind of arid that makes the back of your throat feel raw just from breathing. The horizon shimmered with heat, and the smell of smoke was already thickening as we got closer to the incident area. But nothing about that day ended up being straightforward. We first heard them before we saw them, the unmistakable whir of helicopter blades cutting through the air. 8 of them flying in formation, sleek black shapes against the pale sky. They flew low and close, their precision unnerving. At first, we thought it was just a military drill. After all, we were near Dugway, a place notorious for strange experiments and high-security testing. Maybe it was a little unsettling, sure, but we'd seen similar drills before, so we didn't think much of it. Then, things got weird. We'd just parked and were gearing up to hike to the fire line when it happened. A column of smoke shot straight into the sky, so narrow and precise it looked unnatural. It was a mile away at least, but the concussion hit us like a gut punch, making the ground tremble under our boots. The sound followed a moment later, loud enough to leave our ears ringing. The smoke wasn't from the wildfire we were heading toward. It was something else entirely, something deliberate. We all froze, staring at the smoke column as it rose, impossibly high and eerily perfect. Someone muttered, "What the hell was that?" But no one had an answer. The crew chief, an unflappable guy with years of experience, shrugged it off. "Probably an ordnance test," he said. "We're near a strike zone. Let's focus on the fire." But before we could even start moving, something passed over us, low, silent, and massive. It was an aircraft, but nothing like I'd ever seen before. Flat black with an angular, almost rectangular shape, it looked more like something out of a sci-fi movie than a military arsenal. Fins jutted out at strange angles, and there were wells or indentations along its underside that made it look almost organic, like a massive mechanical creature. It moved slowly, gliding through the air as if it wasn't bound by the same laws of physics as everything else, and it made no noise. Not a hum, not a whisper. Dead silent. The size of it was staggering, and as it passed overhead, I couldn't shake the thought that it resembled some twisted version of the Batmobile from Tim Burton's movies. A flying, predatory machine. We stood there in stunned silence, every one of us craning our necks to watch it disappear into the haze. The quiet that followed was almost as unnerving as the craft itself. Then our radios crackled to life. A voice, calm but authoritative, cut through the static. "Attention, all fire crews in the area. Evacuate immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately." The crew chief grabbed his radio and responded. "This is Bravo team. Who's giving this instruction? What's the situation?" No answer, just a click and silence. Then the incident commander came on. "All crews, this is a direct order. Evacuate the area. You are being reassigned to a higher priority fire." The crew chief pressed again. "What's going on out here? We need more information." "Get moving, Bravo team," the commander snapped. "Now." There was no arguing with that tone. We loaded back into the rigs and started driving, heading south as instructed. The helicopters had disappeared by then, and the sky was eerily clear except for the thin column of smoke that still lingered in the distance. The higher priority fire turned out to be a complete joke. By the time we arrived, the fire had already been extinguished, and we were put on mop-up duty, scraping ash and turning over smoldering debris. The whole thing felt like a distraction, a way to keep us busy and out of the way. And it worked. We never got an explanation, not from the incident commander, not from anyone. Every time we tried to bring it up, the subject got shut down. But the questions never left me. Why didn't the military keep us away from the area in the first place if they were running some kind of high-priority operation? Why let us get so close, only to pull us out after we'd already seen too much? Was it a communications breakdown, or did something go sideways that they hadn't anticipated? I've thought about that black aircraft more times than I can count. I've scoured the internet, looking for anything that even comes close to what we saw that day. The closest I've found are renderings of experimental stealth drones, but even those don't match what we witnessed. It was too large, too quiet, too otherworldly. In that column of smoke, what was that? A weapon test? Some kind of accident? Or something else entirely? Whatever it wasn't meant for us to see. That much I'm sure of. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that we were part of something bigger that day, something we weren't supposed to be part of. I still hear that silent craft in my dreams, feel the weight of its shadow passing overhead, and I still wonder, what else was out there, hidden just beyond the smoke? Redditor 6. It was one of those perfect afternoons, warm, sunny, not a cloud in the sky. My mom and I were on the way back home from my aunt's house, the kind of casual drive where you let the windows down just enough to feel the breeze, but not so much that it messes up the radio's sweet spot. I was in the passenger seat, half paying attention to the road and half lost in my own thoughts, when it happened. At first, it was just a glint of something out of the corner of my eye, like sunlight bouncing off chrome. I turned to look, and there it was, hanging in the sky to our left. An object. No, a craft. Its size was the first thing that struck me. It wasn't just big, it was massive, much larger than anything you'd expect to see up there. It had the classic saucer shape, like something out of an old sci-fi movie, and its surface gleamed brilliantly as the sun reflected off it. It hovered there, impossibly still, as if it were defying gravity itself. This was different, otherworldly. "Mom, do you see that?" I asked, though the question was pointless. She was already staring, her hands tightening on the steering wheel, her eyes wide with the same mixture of awe and disbelief that I was feeling. "I see it," she murmured, almost as if she were afraid speaking too loudly would scare it away. For a few seconds, long enough to count in your head but too short to really process what was happening, we just watched it. My heart was racing and I couldn't look away. The craft hung there, shimmering, as if it were taunting us with its presence. I wanted to say something, to ask what it could be, but the words stuck in my throat. And then it was gone. It didn't drift away or fly off like a jet or a bird. It didn't make a sound. One second it was there, gleaming in the sunlight, and the next it simply vanished. It didn't even leave a trace, no vapor trail, no fading shadow. It was as though it had never existed at all. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yes," Mom said. Her face was pale, her eyes darting between the road and the empty sky where the craft had been. It's just... We didn't say much for the rest of the drive. What was there to say? We'd both seen it, clear as day, and we'd both seen it vanish, as if it had slipped through some invisible crack in reality. It wasn't something you could explain, and it wasn't something you could ignore. Over the years, we've talked about that day many times, revisiting it like a puzzle we can't solve. We've tried to come up with explanations, but none of them fit. It wasn't a plane, not with that size, or the way it hovered. It wasn't a helicopter, those make noise and they don't just disappear. It wasn't a flock of geese or a weather balloon or some trick of the light. It was a solid, tangible object, and we both saw it. Since then, I've become fascinated by UFOs, by the idea that we're not alone in the universe. I've read countless accounts of sightings, watched every documentary I could find, and scoured forums for stories like mine. There are so many people out there with similar experiences, people who saw something they can't explain and are left questioning everything they thought they knew. But even in a sea of stories, ours feels unique. It wasn't just the sighting itself, it was the way the craft vanished. I've never heard anyone describe something so massive disappearing so completely. It wasn't like it cloaked itself or flew away at an impossible speed. It was more like it folded into itself, like it stepped out of our reality entirely. People laugh when I tell them about it. They call it a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, or a case of mistaken identity. They roll their eyes and chuckle, telling me I've watched too many movies or spent too much time on the internet. But that's fine. Let them laugh. I know what I saw. Sometimes I wonder why it appeared to us. Was it random? Were we just in the right place at the right time, two ordinary people catching a glimpse of something extraordinary? Or was it deliberate? Did it want us to see it, to know it was there, if only for a moment? I don't have the answers, and I don't know if I ever will, but I do know this: that afternoon changed something in me. It reminded me how vast and mysterious the universe is, how much is still out there waiting to be discovered. And every time I look up at the sky, I can't help but wonder if it's still up there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Redditor 7. It was one of those nights where the world feels impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you and leaves you with nothing but your thoughts. I was standing outside, far from the hum of city life, in the middle of nowhere. The sky stretched out above me, dark and endless, dotted with stars that seemed brighter than usual. There was no moon, no streetlights, nothing to distract from the vastness above. I've always loved stargazing. Something about it makes you feel small in the best way, like you're part of something much bigger than yourself. That night, I was doing what I always did, tracing the constellations, watching for the occasional plane or satellite making its slow journey across the sky. It was late, maybe 2 a.m, and the air was cool, the kind that prickles your skin and keeps you alert. I spotted what I thought was a satellite. A tiny, steady point of light moving across the sky from right to left. I didn't think much of it. Satellites are common out here. I watched it lazily, letting my mind drift, when something happened that stopped me in my tracks. The light stopped. It didn't slow down or fade, it just stopped, hanging there in the sky like it had run into an invisible wall. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Satellites don't do that. They move in predictable orbits, steady and unchanging. I stared at it, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the movement in the first place, that maybe it was just a stationary star I'd misidentified. And then it moved again. This time it shot off at an angle, sharp and precise, a perfect 45 degrees from the direction it had been traveling. The speed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, disappearing into the darkness without so much as a flicker. It didn't fade out like a plane moving out of view, and it didn't blink like a meteor burning up in the atmosphere. It was just gone. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Satellites don't change direction like that. Planes can't move that fast. And meteors? They streak across the sky in arcs, not angles. Whatever this was, it didn't fit into any box I'd ever known. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the spot where the light had vanished, wondering if I'd really seen it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I doubted, I knew the truth. I'd seen it. I was 100% certain. The problem was, I had no idea what it was. The strangest part wasn't just the movement. It was the way it made me feel. There was something deliberate about the way it stopped, hovered, and shot off, like it had noticed me noticing it. It wasn't random. It wasn't natural. It felt intentional, like it had been watching me as much as I'd been watching it. I stayed outside for a long time after that, scanning the sky, half hoping it would come back and half hoping it wouldn't. The stars blinked down at me, indifferent, as if they hadn't just been the stage for something extraordinary. In the days that followed, I couldn't get the image out of my head. I spent hours researching, trying to find an explanation that made sense. The closest I found were accounts of meteorites with steep angles of attack, where their rapid deceleration can cause them to appear to change direction as they hit the atmosphere. But even that didn't sit right with me. What I saw wasn't a random streak of light burn. It was controlled, precise, and above all, fast. Too fast for anything I'd ever heard of. I've told this story to a few people over the years, and most of them either laugh it off or try to explain it away. You probably just saw a shooting star, they say, or maybe it was a plane and you were looking at it from a weird angle. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a star, it wasn't a plane, and it wasn't a satellite. Sometimes I think about how lucky I was to see it, and other times I wonder if I was unlucky. Seeing something you can't explain has a way of sticking with you, of changing the way you look at the world. It leaves you with more questions than answers. And the biggest question of all, what else is out there? I still go outside at night and watch the stars, hoping to catch another glimpse of something extraordinary. But nothing's ever come close to that night. Whatever it was, it left as suddenly as it appeared, taking its secrets with it. And maybe that's for the best. Because the more I think about it, the more I wonder if some mysteries are better left unsolved. Redditor 8. My dad grew up in rural Illinois in a house nestled at the edge of dense woods, the kind of place where the night swallowed sound and where the sky, unpolluted by city lights, was a canvas of stars. To hear him tell it, strange occurrences were just part of life back then. UFO activity was apparently high in the area, though whether that was unique to their neighborhood or just a quirk of his family's experience, I couldn't say. He and my grandpa used to sit on the porch at night, watching the stars, pointing out lights that darted in ways no plane or satellite ever could. They zipped around like they were playing tag, my dad said once. He chuckled at the memory, though his eyes held something more complicated. We thought it was funny at the time, but looking back, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just the lights. My dad told me about other oddities, things that sounded like they belonged in the pages of a sci-fi novel. Isolated earthquakes no one else felt, glowing orbs that hovered just out of reach, and a sense that the woods around their home were never truly empty. These stories made my childhood magical and eerie in equal measure. My dad wasn't one to lie or embellish, and there was a weight to his words that made me believe him, no matter how outlandish they seemed. One story in particular has always stuck with me. My dad was about 15 at the time, old enough to be skeptical, but young enough to still believe in the extraordinary. It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the sun baked the earth and every breath felt thick with humidity. His parents had gone into town to run errands, leaving him alone at home. He spent the day wandering the property, doing what kids do in the country, throwing rocks, climbing trees, and tinkering with whatever held his interest. He was out in the driveway when he saw it, a black car pulling up the dirt road toward their house. Even from a distance, he knew it was strange. The car was sleek and shiny, with tinted windows that glinted in the sunlight. But what really caught his attention was the sound, or the lack of it. It moved silently, its tires kicking up no gravel, its engine completely inaudible. The car rolled to a stop in the driveway, and my dad just stood there, unsure of what to do. He wasn't scared exactly, but something about the situation felt off. The door opened and a man stepped out. My dad said he looked like no one he'd ever seen before. He was tall, impossibly tall, at least 6.5 feet, with pale, flawless skin that seemed untouched by the summer heat. His hair was blonde, so perfectly combed it looked artificial, and he wore a black suit that seemed tailored to his elongated frame. Even though it was the middle of a sweltering afternoon, he showed no signs of discomfort, no sweat, no flushed skin, and he didn't look real, my dad said, his voice tinged with a faint unease. Like someone trying to look human but missing the mark. The man smiled as he approached, a wide, toothy grin that felt more rehearsed than genuine. My dad said it was the kind of smile that made you uneasy, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes, or, in this case, the sunglasses. "Gwen, are you Dad's name?" the man asked, his voice calm and pleasant but oddly detached. "Yeah," my dad replied, his wariness growing. The man's grin widened. "I just have a few questions for you. I mean no harm." Despite his unease, my dad didn't feel threatened. There was something about the man's demeanor that was disarming, almost hypnotic. The man asked if my dad lived there, and when my dad said yes, he asked if he'd ever seen, heard, or felt anything unusual. "Sometimes," my dad admitted. "Why do you want to know?" The man didn't answer. He just kept smiling, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. My dad pressed him again, but before he could finish his sentence, the man's demeanor changed completely. The smile vanished, replaced by an expression of sudden alarm. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his car, and drove away. The car moved as silently as it had arrived, disappearing down the road until it was nothing more than a shimmer in the heat. A few minutes later, my dad's parents came home. He told them what had happened, but they didn't seem concerned. They shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably just a lost traveler or a government official. But my dad knew better. There was something about the man, his flawless appearance, his strange behavior, the silent car, that didn't sit right with him. Years went by, and the encounter became a strange but distant memory. My dad didn't talk about it much, though I could tell it lingered in the back of his mind. And then, decades later, my mom had her own encounter with the man in the black suit. She was in a bookstore, browsing the aisles, when she noticed him. He was sitting at a table in the cafe area, reading a newspaper. He looked exactly as my dad had described him: tall, pale, blonde, dressed in a black suit and sunglasses. Sitting across from him was another man, dressed identically, his posture just as rigid, his movements just as precise. My mom froze. She'd heard my dad's story before, and the resemblance was too uncanny to ignore. She stared at him, trying to process what she was seeing, when the man looked up. Their eyes, or at least her eyes and his sunglasses, met, and his expression changed immediately. He folded his newspaper, stood up, and walked out of the store, the second man following close behind. When my mom told my dad about it, he wasn't surprised. If anything, he seemed resigned, like he'd been expecting the man to resurface. He didn't have an explanation for who or what the man was, but he was certain it was the same person he'd seen all those years ago. "Maybe he's watching us," my dad said once, "or maybe he's just waiting for something." I've spent years trying to wrap my head around these stories, and the more I think about them, the less sense they make. How could the man look exactly the same after 30 years? Why was he so interested in my dad? And who or what was he? The idea that he could be some kind of government agent crossed my mind, but it didn't add up. His behavior was too strange, too unnatural. Then there's the possibility that he wasn't human at all, that he was something else entirely. An alien? A being from another dimension? The truth is, I don't know. And the not knowing is what keeps me up at night. I'm 22 now, and I can't help but wonder if I'll ever see him. The idea terrifies me. What would I say? What would he want? Would he recognize me as my dad's son? Sometimes I think about what it would be like to meet him, to look into his too perfect face and ask him the questions that have haunted my family for decades. But deep down, I know I don't want to meet him, because whatever the truth is, I'm not sure I'm ready to hear it. Redditor 9. I never told anyone about the patterns. Not really. When you grow up in a small Alabama town where church is mandatory and science is optional, you learn to keep certain things to yourself. But now, after what happened last night, I need to write it all down. Maybe then someone will understand why I did what I did. It started when I was just a kid in Houston, 7 years old, lying on top of my mama's Suburban in the driveway, counting stars because I couldn't sleep. That's when I saw the first one, a light so bright it made the street lamps look like dying fireflies. It hovered over the tree line, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. I called out, but no one came. That was probably for the best. Years passed, and I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Almost. But there was always this feeling, this awareness that something was watching, waiting. It wasn't until 2008 in Tuscaloosa that I understood why. I remember every detail of that night, though I wish I didn't. It was March, somewhere between the 10th and 15th. The days had started blending together by then because I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. My buddy Tyler lived in one of those cookie-cutter garden homes where every house looked identical, like someone had copied and pasted the same building over and over. At exactly 4 a.m., I stepped out of Tyler's place into a night so clear you could see forever. The stars looked wrong somehow, too bright, too aware. That's when I saw it. To my left, a light show that would have put Times Square to shame. Blue, yellow, green, white, red, orange, all strobing and flashing in sequences that made my eyes hurt. But there was no sound, not a whisper. I stood frozen, watching as it glided past the moon. That's when I saw its true shape. Like a teardrop or a sunflower seed, but wrong. The lights weren't coming from it, they were being transmitted through it, shooting upward in patterns that burned themselves into my retinas. Behind it, a thin line of dark exhaust vanished like a forgotten thought. I ran inside to grab Tyler, but by the time we got back, it was too far away. He saw something, but not what I saw. Never what I saw. That's how it always works. When I got home, it wasn't over. 2 dim white lights appeared on the horizon, moving with deliberate slowness. I woke my mother, the only time I ever shared these moments with family. We stood in the driveway for 20 minutes while 5 separate crafts passed overhead. Each one was massive, maybe 150 to 200 feet wide, with white lights that could have swallowed a house. But it was the sound that changed everything. The last craft, flying lower and slower than the others, let out a noise that I still hear in my nightmares. Imagine a digital scream multiplied by 50, a sound that bypasses your ears and writes itself directly into your brain. It did this twice. A greeting, a warning, a mark. I started crying right there in the driveway, my mother's hand gripping mine so tight it hurt. I heard that should have been enough, more than enough. But they weren't done with me. A few weeks later, I was in my driveway again, always the driveway, always at night, smoking and listening to music on my iPad. On a whim, I started playing with the backlight, waving my hand over it to create a strobe effect. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. Directly above me, not even 75 feet up, hovered something impossible. A trapezoid with rounded edges, outlined in pulsating dark red and black energy that flowed like liquid electricity. It moved like nothing on Earth, swaying in patterns that made my eyes water and my brain itch. When I waved, why did I wave? It changed its light pattern and drifted away behind my house. Later, I realized it wanted me to follow. They always want me to follow. I've seen that same craft 3 more times in Tuscaloosa, Hoover, and Bessemer. Each time, it shows itself just long enough to be unmistakable, then vanishes in ways that defy physics. Sometimes it stretches to twice its length before the bottom shoots forward like it's hitting light speed. Sometimes it just stops being there. But the dreams are worse than the sightings. One night in Tuscaloosa, I dreamed of cold metal and rubber touching places it shouldn't. I couldn't see or hear, but I could feel everything. The next morning, there was a perfect white ring in the grass behind my house, 8 or 10 feet wide. My mother said she heard something in the night but dismissed it. We always dismiss it, until we can't anymore. The incident at Shelton State Community College nearly broke me. The static came first, like a jet engine underwater. Then I saw it, a vertical slit in the sky, maybe 200 yards long, glowing light blue with white electricity crackling along its edges. 25 white objects shot out of it, one after another, each leaving those familiar trails behind them. When it was done, the bottom of the slit zipped up like a cosmic zipper, accompanied by a sound that doesn't exist in nature. After that, I started seeing the orbs, sometimes solid, sometimes pulsing, always moving in ways that suggest intelligence. They brighten and fade, dance and dart, following patterns that feel like language if I stare long enough. I've started to recognize some of them, started to understand. I did research, trying to make sense of it all. Found out about contactees, people like me who aren't just witnesses but are kept up with, monitored, selected. But why me? What makes me so special? Or am I just convenient? Last night, everything changed. I was in my driveway again. Always the driveway, but this time I was ready. I'd set up my iPad to recreate that strobe pattern from years ago. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the trapezoid appeared. It was closer than ever before, close enough that I could see details I'd missed in previous encounters. The surface wasn't solid, it rippled and shifted like oil on water, but darker than dark. The red and black energy outline pulsed in a sequence I recognized from my dreams. And there was something else, something new, a sound, not like the digital scream from years ago, but a low hum that made my feelings vibrate and my vision blur. This time I followed. It led me through the sleeping neighborhoods of Tuscaloosa, past Shelton State, into areas I didn't even know existed. The houses thinned out, then disappeared entirely. The trapezoid maintained a perfect distance, close enough to follow, far enough to deny. In a clearing I'd never seen before, and I'm still not sure exists, it stopped. The humming grew louder, and the air took on a metallic taste. That's when I saw them all, every craft I'd ever encountered, arranged in a perfect circle around the clearing. The sunflower seed shape from 2008, the massive crafts with the house-sized lights. Dozens of orbs pulsing in sync. They were waiting for me, had always been waiting for me. What happened next? I'm still trying to process it. The patterns I'd been seeing all these years weren't random. They were a language, a code, a key to understanding something so vast and alien that my mind keeps trying to look away from the memory. They showed me things, impossible things, beautiful things. I learned why they chose me, why they've been watching since I was that 7-year-old kid on a Suburban in Houston. It's not about me, not really. It's about patterns. Patterns in stars, in light, in human behavior. Patterns that repeat across galaxies and species and dimensions. They're collectors, but not of specimens or data. They collect patterns, and sometimes, rarely, they find humans who can see these patterns naturally. People like me. People who can't help but notice when the stars look wrong, or when lights move in ways they shouldn't. I'm writing this from my driveway. The sun will rise soon, but the stars are still visible. They look different now. I understand their patterns, their dance, their message. The trapezoid craft is gone, but I know it's not far. It's never far anymore. To anyone reading this, if you've seen them, if you've felt that unmistakable sensation of being watched, if you've ever noticed patterns in the sky that shouldn't be there, you're not crazy, but be careful what you wish for. Understanding comes at a price. Look for the patterns. They're everywhere once you know how to see them. in the way traffic lights change at night, in the rhythm of cicadas, in the spaces between heartbeats. But whatever you do, don't wave at them. Don't acknowledge them. Unless, like me, you're ready to become part of the pattern yourself. Written by James Cooper, found on a laptop in a driveway in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The laptop was surrounded by a perfect white ring, 8 feet in diameter. No other trace of Cooper has ever been found. Redditor 10. Some memories refuse to fade. They stay sharp while everything around them blurs, like a single photograph in perfect focus while the whole album yellows and curls. For me, that memory is from a Sunday afternoon in October 10 years ago, when my father, my brother Tommy, and I saw something that changed how we look at the sky forever. I've tried telling this story before, but it never comes out right. Maybe that's because impossible things are hard to pin down with words, or maybe it's because the truth about that day lives somewhere between what we saw and what we think we saw, in that strange twilight space where reality bends but doesn't quite break. We were heading back to Mom's house in Dad's old Land Rover Defender, the dark green one with the squeaky sunroof that he'd bought after the divorce. Dad always took the long way home on our weekends with him, cutting through the Ashworth forest instead of taking the main road. He said it was to avoid traffic, but I think he just wanted to stretch out our time together. Tommy was 12 then, still young enough to believe in everything and old enough to remember it. I was 15, caught in that awkward space between childhood wonder and teenage cynicism. Dad was trying his best to be 2 weekends a month of perfect fatherhood crammed into a few precious hours. The forest road twisted through pine trees that had been there longer than the pavement beneath our tires. October had painted everything in shades of amber and gold, and falling leaves danced in our wake like confetti. Tommy was talking about his latest obsession, space exploration, and the possibility of alien life. Dad was nodding along, making those encouraging noises parents make when they're half listening. That's when everything changed. "Look at that," Dad said, his voice different somehow, quieter, heavier. At first, I thought he was pointing out a particularly bright patch of autumn leaves. But his finger was aimed up, through the sunroof, at something that shouldn't have been there. Hovering about 20 meters above us was, that's where words start to fail. The closest I can come is to say it was a perfect circle, dark gray against the October sky, but that doesn't capture it, not really. It was like someone had cut a hole in reality and lined it with technology we hadn't invented yet. Around its circumference were bright white lights, each one identical to the next, spaced with a precision that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. They weren't blinding, though, more like deliberate, like they wanted to be seen but not to blind. The Land Rover's engine rumbled beneath us as we slowed to a crawl, but the thing above us made no sound at all. None. The silence felt deliberate, too, as if the very air around it was holding its breath. "Do you see it?" Dad whispered, though we were all staring up through the sunroof. Tommy had gone completely still beside me, his hand gripping the door handle so tight his knuckles had gone white. Along the bottom and sides of the craft, because that's what it had to be even if my mind kept trying to find some other explanation, ran what looked like square pipes or conduits. They followed patterns that seemed random at first but suggested purpose the longer you looked at them. And between these mechanical structures, barely visible against the dark gray surface, were markings that made my head swim. "Are those letters?" Tommy asked, his voice small and strange. They weren't letters, not really. But they weren't random scratches either. They were symbols, or maybe hieroglyphs, etched into the surface with a precision that made modern manufacturing look primitive. Some seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them, like trying to remember a word that's on the tip of your tongue. Dad had stopped the Land Rover completely now. We sat there in the middle of the forest road, autumn leaves swirling around us, while this impossible thing hung in the sky above our sunroof. The top of it curved upward like a bowl, a lighter shade of gray that somehow looked both metallic and not quite solid. For 8 minutes, I know because I watched the digital clock on the dashboard tick each minute away, we sat there in silence. None of us took pictures. None of us reached for phones. We just watched. Sometimes I think we knew, even then, that this wasn't something that could be captured in pixels and megabytes. Eventually, we had to move on. The sun was setting, and Mum would be waiting. As we drove away, I watched in the rear window as the craft remained perfectly still, hovering over the spot where we'd stopped, until the trees swallowed it from view. The rest of the drive was quiet. Even Tommy, who normally couldn't stop talking about aliens and UFOs, sat in silence. I think we were all trying to file what we'd seen into categories our minds could handle, and all failing. When we got to Mum's house, she was waiting on the porch with that look she always had after our weekends with Dad. Part relief, part worry, part resignation. She asked us how our weekend was, and we all answered with variations of, fine. None of us mentioned what we'd seen. Some things feel too fragile for casual conversation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those symbols. The way they seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. I got up and tried to draw them in my notebook, but they slipped away like dreams after waking. The more I tried to remember their exact shapes, the more they felt like memories of memories. The next morning, Tommy asked Dad if we could drive the same route again. We did, but of course, the craft was gone. The forest looked ordinary in the morning light, leaves still falling, birds still singing. If it weren't for the way Dad kept glancing up through the sunroof, I might have convinced myself it had all been a shared dream. Over the years, we've talked about it a few times, just the three of us. Never with anyone else, how could we? Each time we remember slightly different details. Tommy swears the symbols were gold color, while Dad remembers them as deeper gray than the surface they were etched into. I remember them changing color, but that might be my mind trying to make sense of something it couldn't quite process. What we all remember with perfect clarity is the size of it, exactly the same diameter as the road we were driving on, the precision of those white lights, the complete and utter silence, the way it felt, both absolutely solid and somehow not quite there, like a reflection in still water that you could almost, but not quite, touch. Dad sold the Land Rover 3 years later, but before he did, we took one last drive along that forest road. We didn't see anything unusual that day, but we all kept looking up through the sunroof, hoping, or maybe fearing, that it would be there again. Tommy had started university by then, studying aerospace engineering. He says it's not because of what we saw that day, but sometimes I wonder. I'm 30 now with a daughter of my own. Sometimes, on clear nights, she asks me to tell her stories about when I was young. I tell her about the divorce, about weekends with Dad, about Tommy's endless space facts. But I've never told her about what we saw through the sunroof. Not because I don't think she'd believe me in my life. Kids are better at believing impossible things than adults are. I haven't told her because some experiences are like those symbols on the craft. They change when you try to look at them directly. Last month, I drove that forest road for the first time in years. The trees are taller now, their branches reaching further over the pavement, making patterns of light and shadow on the road. I found myself slowing down at the spot where we'd stopped that day, though I'm not sure how I recognized it. Everything looks different after 10 years. I caught myself looking up through my car's sunroof, half expecting to see that dark gray circle hanging in the autumn sky. Instead, I saw only branches and leaves and patches of blue sky between them. But for just a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the patterns of light and shadow, something deliberate, something precise. Dad passed away last spring. At his funeral, Tommy and I stood under umbrellas in the rain, watching the coffin being lowered into the ground. Neither of us mentioned that day with the craft, but I know we were both thinking about it. It was one of those rare moments we had with Dad that felt completely real, completely shared, even if we never fully understood what we'd shared. Sometimes I wonder if that's what it was really about, not the craft itself, but the experience of seeing it together. Three people who struggled to connect in ordinary ways, suddenly united by something extraordinary. Maybe that's why the memory stays so sharp while others fade, not because of what we saw, but because of how we saw it. Together, through a sunroof, on a forest road that seemed to go on forever. I still dream about those symbols sometimes. In the dreams, I can read them perfectly, and they tell a story about three people in a Land Rover, looking up through a sunroof at something impossible. But when I wake up, the meaning slips away, like autumn leaves in the wind, leaving only the memory of having understood something important, if only, and maybe that's enough.